2 of the program. Bold Republic is back on the air. My name is Glenn Woods. Thanks for joining me. And on the line right now from Wyoming Liberty Group, looking particularly dapper as if he had just combed his hair moments before he came on, is Boyd, which is good to see you again. How have you been?
Oh, we're doing well. How are you doing, Glenn?
Alive and kicking. I noticed something the other day, Boyd, is when it is minus 10 degrees for about a week and a half, and then suddenly the temperature jumps up to 27 degrees and it's sunny, it's okay to step outside without a coat or sweater on and just enjoy the warmth and stretch, even though it's only 27 degrees.
Well, as long as we don't have humidity or too much wind, 20-something is really comfortable. That's one of the things I enjoyed in Laramie.
Yeah. What's the weather been like down in Cheyenne before we get into the topic?
Oh, it's been plenty warm. The wind kicked up today. Yesterday was glorious.
Right.
It was hard to stay in the office and work.
Yeah, okay. Sometimes you should just move your desk outside, is my opinion. Okay, so speaking of work, what have you been working on?
Well, of late, I've been dealing with local land use regulations that aim to stifle speech.
Okay, now
situation. I've got property rights and free speech.
This conversation, ever since Maureen told me that this is what you were going to be on about, because there's two things that really get me, Boyd, and one of them is freedom of speech.
Yes.
You know, this is an irritating phrase that people have. Freedom is opinions are like holes. Everybody has one. In my opinion,
Yes.
but you live in a free country. Why would you try to shut somebody up that way? We should all be expressing ourselves as often as we feel the urge, because, I mean, people fought and died for that right. And yet you don't.
Well, we should express ourselves as often as we feel is appropriate of our own choosing. And
Right.
I may choose differently than you, but I'm not going to choose for you.
Okay, and now let's add to that. You cannot have that freedom of speech unless you have property rights. The two go hand in hand, don't they?
Yes, and interestingly, we're managing to wrap both of them up into one little nice, neat package down here in Cheyenne.
Okay, now, what is supposed to be a very conservative state, how does this happen in Cheyenne, and what are they doing to the people down there?
The line I kept hearing locally is that people who are putting signs up in their yard for political reasons or any kind of opinion, whether it says "Go Pokes" or "Free Tibet" or "Vote for Enzi or Cheney" or take your pick, that somehow was hurting others' property rights because it was hurting their property values, the cash value of their house, perhaps, and therefore said proclamations of preference should cease. Put another way, everybody's supposed to be nice and tidy and not say a thing.
Okay, let's get into, because I've had this discussion with some listeners before I even had a guy from, a nice gentleman from South Dakota. We got into a little bit of a debate about this. So let's get away from a sign for a moment. Let's say my neighbor has a car up on blocks in his front yard, and it's leaking oil, and I would like to sell my house for $200,000, but I can't do that because he's bringing down my property values. So do I have some kind of a right to bring him to court, or should we have laws against him having a car up on blocks in his front yard?
That gets a little trickier. If he's got a car up on blocks and it's leaking oil and the oil is running onto your property and contaminating your property, now we've got a nuisance. This is a private nuisance.
Yeah, okay.
I recently in Casper, they had a debate about whether or not too many old cars constituted a public nuisance, which is different than a private nuisance. People around Cheyenne seem to think that election signs or signs that say support our troops or save the whales also constitute a nuisance, notwithstanding Supreme Court disagreement. So, your car leaking oil, contaminating your property, yes.
Yeah.
Your neighbor having a different opinion and speaking it, no, that's not a nuisance.
Now, let me get nitpicky with you, but you're a lawyer, so this is what you do, okay? We're going to get nitpicky about the language here. So let's say I want to put up a big I don't know, save the jackalope sign in my front yard, because that's my
Okay.
opinion. It's an endangered species, and I can't believe that last year the Senate actually tried to label it as an official mythical creature. We don't ever want people outside of the state knowing that it's not real. So, okay, save the jackalope sign goes up, but I want to put it in my front yard, and it's literally billboard size.
Okay. And I think then you start getting into issues, and you start being able to weigh, what are the costs to your neighbors? To what extent are you interfering with their quiet enjoyment of their property, of their private property? And that's the technical term. If now they can't seem to get light to shine in one side of their house because you have blocked the sun,
right,
you can probably get into trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And around here, we're not arguing that residents should be able to put up billboards in a quarter acre lot. But the problem around here is we're talking being able to limit how long people can put up a sign, and we're talking about limiting how many signs people can put up.
And the size of the sign, for that matter.
Well, the size of the sign, and I think the size is a little bit small. I think, I think people should be able to put up what they want as long as it's not too close to their neighbor's property or to the street. But that's a policy argument.
Right.
But I don't think the courts even would let you limit how long somebody can put up a sign,
right,
or limit how many signs you put up at election time, or anything that would actually effectively make someone not speak.
Okay.
Now, how big letters you use is different than whether or not you're even allowed to put up the sign in the first instance.
I'm talking with Boyd Wiggum, who's from the. Am I saying that right, Wiggum?
It's Wiggum, yes.
Wiggum,
I think you got it.
From Wyoming Liberty Group, and we're talking about freedom of speech in Cheyenne and property rights, which go hand in hand. So, okay, we've established, in your opinion, that sure, we can go ahead and restrict, maybe have some rules on the size of the sign within reason, and perhaps the placement, as long as it's not obstructing the neighbor in some way. Okay, fine. What about language? Let's get into, let's say, we can start easy. Obscene language.
Well, obscenity isn't a tricky thing, and it's one of those things they say you know it when you see it, and I suppose if it's obscene language, we've got some wiggle room. Okay. But, that's a little trickier question.
Okay.
That's different than whether or not you can have any language whatsoever. And that's what we're arguing about here, is whether or not you have any language whatsoever.
There you go. Because I think if someone wants to use obscene language, then a judge should say, oh, you can deliver the same message. You just can't deliver it using those offensive words. But you're allowed to say the same thing. Then you're not obstructing their freedom of speech, are you?
Well, but
don't drop the F-bomb.
Yeah, well, but you still have Cohen v. California, I believe, where somebody walked into a courthouse with his F-bomb on the back of his jacket, and you know what? That was okay.
Okay, all right. So I guess that will fall under community standards then, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and then you get into that world.
Okay, all right.
I want to get back to the issue of, we're talking about using land use regulations to make sure that no language goes up around Cheyenne.
See, now that's where I'm trying to ease my way into that, because what kind of language is one thing. Now what about political language? Because let's say I am not a Republican, but we'll say I'm a Republican, and my sign offends the Democrats that are the majority of the neighborhood. What about then?
The Supreme Court has absolutely said that political speech is the most sacred of speech under the First Amendment. And offensive, if you're going to take a contrary viewpoint, any kind of robust, engaged dialogue that's going to tease out the truth of an issue is inherently going to involve disagreement. It's going, objection is offensive to those who like the status quo. Back in 1775, the idea of a republic was very offensive to those who lived in the in what would become the United States, and believed in the divine right of kings.
Right.
That was offensive. But free speech has to allow for offensiveness, especially when what we're talking about here is it's non-commercial speech. It's not trying to drum up a buck, even though that's protected as well. We're talking about speech about ideas.
Okay,
First
now,
principles.
see, again, I'm slowly leading you to this now. What about limiting when I could put up a sign? Maybe during an election year, but we're not in an election year, so they're not going to let me put up a pro-candidate sign when we're outside of an election year. Can you limit when I can put up a sign?
I don't think so. I mean, the courts have said you can have reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on speech. However, when you're talking about core political speech, I do not believe that the courts have allowed governments to force people to become silent because of the time frame that the person wants to speak.
Okay, because I have noticed, and see what you think about this. This has happened a few times in Gillette. We have a political season. Somebody has a candidate sign in their yard for sheriff, and then the race is over, the election's won, and 6 months later, that sign's still sitting in their yard. It doesn't matter if the candidate won or lost, and the city would like to see that sign go.
Well, the question is does the person who owns the property want the sign to come down?
Right.
If the person is celebrating a victory or leaving it up as a protest symbol, that is still current speech. That is still making a point, communicating an idea. That is what the First Amendment protects.
I'm talking with Boyd Wiggum from Wyoming Liberty Group about free speech, and let's get to the meat of it now. So for those who have been wondering, what exactly happened in Cheyenne? Boyd, what happened in Cheyenne that has you so upset?
Well, about a year and a half ago, the city adopted a new set of zoning ordinances. Included in those zoning ordinances were some regulations for signs. And included in those sign regulations were regulations that applied to political signs, ideological signs, just any signs in somebody's yard in residential areas. And I'll be doggone if somehow or another we didn't wind up with a local law that says you can put up a sign beginning in a residential area 10 days before a distinct event or time period. I haven't figured out exactly what that means. I've heard what the enforcement people say, but they won't put it in writing. And you have to take it down 10 days after the election, and you're only allowed 2. That means you can advocate for maybe a mayor and one council person, but not the other council person running in your district, so long as you're willing to remain silent on governor or senator races. And so that's what we're dealing with, is a city that says you're allowed to speak for a period of days, limited period of days on political issues, but you can pick 2 at a time. Assuming, and these are temporary signs, so this would include perhaps a real estate sign. If you're selling your house and there's an election going on, you might have to stay silent on all but one race.
Okay, hang on for just a moment. I got to pay some bills, Boyd, but then I want to find out what exactly is the city's justification for this and what's being done about it. Hang on. More with Wyoming Liberty Group in just a moment. My name is Glenn Woods, and joining me from Cheyenne, Wyoming Liberty Group, is Boyd Wiggum, who we've been talking about property rights and free speech rights, which do go hand in hand, and we're heading down to Cheyenne right now to rejoin Boyd again. So, okay. I think where we left off, Boyd, was I was only allowed to keep a sign in my yard 10 days before an event. Do I have that right?
You were allowed to put it up 10 days before whatever event it was talking about, and you had to take it down 10 days afterwards. Afterwards,
okay. What is their justification for this?
Well, they justify it on 2 bases. One is aesthetics, making the neighborhood look tidy, keeping property values up.
Right.
What we were talking about, worrying about just the neighboring property rights. And the other is talking about things like safety, pedestrian safety, automobile safety, and being able to and to not have too much clutter in the area so you can't read the signs.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the conversation courts have had in the past.
Right.
And those issues are recognized as important but not compelling. Whereas when you start specifically limiting types of speech, you get into a world where government can only restrict speech if that speech is if there's a compelling interest. So it's this weird balancing test that the Supreme Court likes to impose on us, as opposed to saying here's the bright line rules. And so you've got to figure that out.
Well, it's okay. So the next question then, because what you're talking about has actually happened all over the country, and I hate to say it, in many cities around the country, it's happened even worse than this. So down in Cheyenne, is anybody doing anything about this? What can be done about this?
Well, we've spent the last 2 months trying to convince the city to fix their problem. They voted not to fix it in December. I'm hearing rumors they're going to bring it back up for discussion at their next meeting. And there are people that are looking for ways to maybe push them. I've heard more than one person asking, how can we push back? I'm not a fan of civil disobedience personally. I remember being offended by the concept when my English teacher told me to read Thoreau's work. But this is an example of when I think that it can be justified, and there may be people going to do that. And in the past, courts have had to weigh in, and I would expect a court to need to weigh in again.
Should actually engage in civil disobedience, and this may actually be one of those times. Okay, I have no idea if people in Cheyenne will actually go down that path and actually just go ahead and put up a sign. We'll see. I would if I were in Cheyenne. I have never been someone to engage so much in civil disobedience myself, but I would put a sign up just as a matter of protest. But then the next thing is, and this is something we have to seriously consider as we talk to each other, well, as we deal with city councils like this around the nation, not just in Cheyenne, but around the nation, we have to consider getting together as a group and heading down to city council meetings and showing up en masse.
Well, people have done that, and I'm sorry, I missed part of what you said in there.
We had I'm glad your audio is back anyway. I'm trying to get the video back. We had this drop out on us, but I can hear you right now, Boyd. So, okay.
Yes. I can hear you now, too.
Mass was where I left off. So what do you think? Has any of that, I can see you now, has any of that happened there?
Yes, at the last two meetings, there were several people who showed up and told the council in no uncertain terms what they thought of the existing rules and pushed the issue.
Right.
This is, I mean, even the ACLU has come over and paid a visit and contributed. We have been there. I've been following this issue through the Planning Commission and the City Council meeting, through all of the meetings, and an attorney who was counsel the last time the City Council tried to force people to take down signs and had to take the City Council to court has been involved throughout.
That and lawsuits. Can you hear me now, Boyd?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Finish your thought with the attorney real quick, because I've got about a minute left and I got to go. I'm sorry for the problems here. Suddenly we're having some internet problems. Go ahead.
Yes. A local attorney named Tim Kingston was involved in a prior lawsuit and won. And one of the nice things we had for a while is the local court had struck down the previous sign ordinance that applied to political signs, and nothing was in place as best as anybody can tell, and we didn't have a aesthetic problem with political signs. And he has been engaged in trying to cope with this new ordinance from the time that he realized that a new one had been adopted. And so
there are people down there that are fighting this now, and so there is hope for Cheyenne, in other words.
Well, there is. Now, one thing that might be a little interesting for all your listeners, I've seen other towns in this state that have have limitations on when you can put up political signs and when you can take them down.
Right.
And that was the provision that was struck down in the previous lawsuit back in the 90s when Tim Kingston was attorney.
Now,
it might be worth people taking a look.
I'm sorry, at this point I got to drop out to a hard break. I apologize for that. Boyd, thanks for coming on. I'm sorry about the technical problems there, but the internet does drop out on us from time to time. Thanks for coming on.
It does that.